The courtroom froze, not because of the gavel, but because Judge Franklin Ward laughed, not politely, not nervously, but with sharp mockery. As Leonard Drake, a decorated veteran, broke down mid-sentence, tears tracing the edges of his worn cheeks, he didn't shout, didn't flinch. He just stood there, spine half straight, the weight of 3 tours pressing against his silence, letting the ridicule fall like dust on his uniform. But what no one knew, not the judge, not the bailiff, not even Leonard himself, was that someone had just stepped into the hallway, and that someone still wore stars on his shoulder and fire in his voice. Before the hour was over, that room would stand, every seat, every rank, every silence broken, and the man who once mocked would sit alone in the echo of his own shame. Because sometimes the most powerful verdict doesn't come from the bench. It comes from the people we thought had been forgotten. So, if you still believe in honor, stay. If this shook something in you, type honor below. And if deep down you still believe courage can change even a courtroom, this story is for you. Leonard Drake was 42 years old, though his face, etched with quiet exhaustion, carried the weight of a man twice that. His jawline, once strong beneath a clean-shaven grin, was now shadowed by days-old stubble, and the pale lines around his eyes traced stories no one had asked to hear. He still stood tall, out of habit more than pride, but the slight favoring of his left leg betrayed the shrapnel embedded there since Helmand Province. Each morning at exactly 6:15, he brewed 1 cup of black coffee, placed it precisely 2 inches from the edge of the table, and stared through his kitchen window. Not to watch, but to wait, as if expecting a knock that never came. Leonard lived alone in a 1-bedroom rental outside Springfield, Missouri. No pets, no photos on the fridge, just a folded flag above the mantel and a stack of worn letters from men who hadn't made it home. He had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, earned 2 commendations for valor, and carried more guilt than medals. After discharge, there were no parades, just paperwork. No job offers, just apologies. He worked nights as a security guard at an abandoned textile plant, invisible to the world he'd once fought to protect. When he tried to speak at town halls about PTSD funding, most eyes glazed over, most chairs emptied. Except last Thursday, when Senator Malcolm Reeve voted against the bill he once promised to support. Leonard didn't yell, he didn't threaten, but that night he stood outside the senator's home, holding a hand-painted sign. 1 sentence, 7 words, and the way the senator's wife looked through the curtains, half fear, half disgust, Leonard knew something had shifted. Something was coming. It started with the gavel. 3 sharp strikes that echoed like gunfire through the marble chamber. Case number 40,713, the clerk announced flatly, barely glancing up. Leonard Drake stood, his left leg locking stiffly before catching itself. Beside him, Alyssa Monroe, his court-appointed attorney, barely older than the law degree hanging in her office, clutched her notes with both hands. She looked like she hadn't slept. Maybe she hadn't. They'd only met the day before, but she had stayed up all night reviewing his military record, reading between the lines of citations and discharge papers, searching for something more than just a defense. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady despite the weight in the air. "Mr. Drake pleads not guilty. His actions, while perhaps poorly timed, were born out of desperation for mental health services denied to him and his fellow veterans." Judge Franklin Ward didn't look up. He adjusted his glasses, brows unmoving, tone flat as cement. "Monroe, this court does not hand out leniency as payment for patriotism." He disturbed a public official at his private residence. "The law applies equally." Alyssa tried again, citing PTSD, via backlogs, community impact letters. The judge cut her off with a dismissive wave. "Everyone has problems, counselor. This is not a therapy session. Leonard hadn't said a word. Until now. Your Honor, he said quietly, voice worn but deliberate. I didn't go there to cause trouble. I just wanted him to explain. 22 veterans die by suicide every day. I've buried 4 of my own brothers. He swallowed, but the tears came anyway. Uninvited. Unstoppable. I'm not asking for me anymore. I'm asking for the ones who didn't come home. His shoulders shook. The silence in the room thickened, until Judge Ward leaned back, scoffed, and let out a short, bitter laugh. Mr. Drake, save the theatrics for Memorial Day parades. This is a court of law. Gasps rippled through the room, faint but audible. Even the bailiff shifted uncomfortably. Leonard didn't raise his voice, didn't glare. He just reached into his coat, pulled out a single letter, folded, creased, familiar, and laid it on the table. A handwritten note from one of the men he lost. Alyssa's hand hovered near his, not to stop him, but to steady him. No one in the gallery moved. No one objected. And that silence, that cold, watching silence, was the loudest betrayal of all. Then, without fanfare, Alyssa stepped back and opened the heavy oak door at the rear of the courtroom. She didn't say a word, just nodded once, to someone waiting just outside. Leonard looked up, confused. She hadn't mentioned any witnesses. And when the door finally opened, the sound of polished heels and a steel-tipped cane striking marble floor was all anyone could hear. The courtroom door creaked wider, swallowing the ambient murmurs like a throat sealing shut. And then he stepped in, not with noise, not with haste, but with the kind of gravity that pulled every gaze toward him. Colonel Mason Briggs. Full-dress uniform. Row upon row of ribbons resting across a chest that had once led battalions through desert storms and blackout jungles. His left leg, steel from mid-thigh down, clicked softly against the floor, but it was the right foot that struck true with each step, like a drumline summoning silence. Every juror, every clerk, every idle spectator instinctively straightened as he passed. Even Judge Franklin Ward shifted slightly in his chair, more out of reflex than respect. The gavel in his hand rested heavier now, as if unsure whether it still held authority in this room. Leonard Drake's mouth parted, but no sound emerged. His eyes locked on Mason's silhouette, stunned, as if memory had been made flesh again. Colonel Briggs walked like a man, used to bearing the weight of others, of choices, of silence, of men who didn't come back. His eyes, gray like spent gunmetal, scanned the courtroom not with defiance, but calculation, until they landed on Leon. And there, for the briefest flicker, something softened. "Permission to approach, Your Honor," Mason said. Not a question, but a courtesy. Judge Ward adjusted his glasses, clearly unsettled. "State your name and relevance to the case." "Mason Briggs, retired, United States Army. I'm here as a character witness for Staff Sergeant Leonard Drake." The words weren't loud, but they landed like an oath. Leonard's hands twitched, reflex memory from combat posture, then clenched around the edge of the table. Alyssa Monroe's breath hitched so quietly, it might have been mistaken for silence itself. As the colonel made his way to the witness stand, the courtroom became a cathedral. No prayers, no sermons, just the rustle of fabric as people leaned forward without knowing why. The judge opened his mouth to object, but didn't. Mason's presence made protest feel juvenile, like denying gravity. Once sworn in, Mason didn't launch into testimony. Instead, he turned to Leonard and simply said, "It's been a while." Leonard nodded, voice lost, eyes shimmering. Then came the moment no one noticed, until it passed. Mason reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Not for the judge, not for the clerk, but for Leonard. A photocopy of a mission debriefing from Kandahar, 2016. Blood-stained in the original. The date Leonard pulled him from a burning Humvee. Mason didn't speak of it. He didn't need to. Instead, he turned back to the judge. "I'll keep this brief, but it matters you hear it from me." And in that stillness, before any more was said, Judge Ward leaned forward ever so slightly. Because he knew, as did everyone in the room, the tide had shifted. No one needed an introduction. Everyone knew what came next. Judge Franklin Ward didn't speak, didn't blink, didn't even breathe too deeply when Colonel Mason Briggs took the witness stand, his voice steady as steel. Nor when Alyssa Monroe presented the 37 handwritten letters from veterans whose lives had been saved by Leonard Drake's support group. Nor even when Leonard himself stood upright, tears dried on his cheek, his jaw clenched, not in rage, but in restraint. But when the heavy doors creaked once more, and the old wheelchair rolled in with a quiet squeak that somehow silenced the entire courtroom, Franklin's spine twitched just once. It wasn't just any man. It was General Everett Ward, his father, the man whose portrait still hung in the West Point mess hall, the man whose words had shaped entire battalions, and once upon a time, a boy named Franklin. His face was pale now, sunken, worn by age. But when he looked up at his son, there was no weakness in that gaze, only gravity. He was wheeled forward by a middle-aged woman with calm hands, and as they stopped near the front, everyone seemed to lean in without moving. The general didn't need volume. His voice cut through decades and titles with just one sentence. "When I fought for this country, it wasn't for veterans to be laughed at by judges. Especially not my own son." A breath caught somewhere in the gallery. Nobody dared exhale. Franklin's face froze. He looked at the bailiff, who looked away, at Alyssa, who remained still as stone, at Colonel Briggs, now standing, holding something in his gloved hand. A photo, faded, folded, nearly torn, but unmistakable. 4 Marines, 1 Humvee in flames, and 1 man, Leonard Drake, carrying Mason Briggs on his back, bloody, limping, eyes full of fire. "He didn't ask for a medal," Briggs said quietly. "He asked for a conversation. You gave him mockery." Franklin swallowed. Hard. "And the man he stood outside confronting?" Mason added, stepping closer. "That senator promised funding for housing, for PTSD treatment. I was there, 3 years ago. Nothing changed." The weight of those words didn't slam down like a hammer. It settled, like smoke, like fog, like the truth that can't be wiped away. Then, the general leaned forward slightly in his chair. His fingers tapped once on the armrest. "You knew that, Franklin, and you still laughed." Franklin's fingers hovered near the gavel, trembling. No one spoke. Not one person in the gallery shifted. The black shirts stood in unison. Veterans stand together. Some were in wheelchairs, some with scars, all of them silent, unmoving, watching. And then Leonard Drake raised his eyes, not pleading, not angry, just clear. And for the first time that day, Franklin Ward blinked. Not in power, but in fear, because no one needed to shout. Everyone in that courtroom already knew. A reckoning had begun. Alyssa Monroe didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. She simply tapped the corner of the evidence screen, and a grainy surveillance video lit up behind the judge's bench. No music. No edits. Just raw truth, captured by a city security camera from across the street. There was Leonard Drake, standing alone on the sidewalk, a simple cardboard sign in his hands. "You promised." No shouting. No movement. Just stillness. After 38 seconds, the front door opened. Senator Malcolm Reeve stepped out, glanced at the sign, muttered something to a staffer, then disappeared back inside. 2 police officers arrived minutes later. One asked Leonard to move. The other didn't wait for a response. The footage zoomed in, Leonard's chest being shoved, his feet stumbling back. The video stopped. The silence didn't. Judge Franklin Ward leaned forward ever so slightly, his mouth opening halfway, then freezing. Alyssa spoke, calm and slow. "You called that aggressive trespassing. That was peaceful assembly." From the back of the courtroom, a rustle of movement. 2 officers, uniformed, stepped into the aisle, not toward Leonard, but toward the gallery. Toward Senator Reeve. The senator's shoulders tensed. His eyes flicked left, then right. The younger officer stepped forward. "Sir, you swore under oath that the defendant was yelling threats." I thought he was. I felt." The senator stammered. "You felt," the officer repeated, voice flat. "But the footage doesn't lie." Franklin Ward's knuckles whitened around his gavel. He didn't strike it. Couldn't. Not when the very weight of his authority now trembled beneath the eyes of the veterans watching him. General Everett Ward cleared his throat, voice low but resonant. "There's no honor in silence when truth is bruised and kneeling." The words hit harder than any sentence. One by one, heads began to lower in the gallery. The man who had whispered, "Get a job," under his breath, 2 days earlier now, sat stiff, eyes locked on the floor. The waitress who had rolled her eyes that morning wiped a tear without knowing why. A teenager in the last row mouthed, barely audible, "You were wrong." Leonard Drake never moved. He didn't need to. Because truth, when seen by all, does its own walking. The senator stood, hands slightly raised, as the officer gently turned him around. A quiet clink, handcuffs, sounded like justice being spoken without a voice. He said nothing as he was led from the room. No apology, no excuse, only his steps, slow and heavy. Judge Franklin Ward still hadn't moved, but everyone else had. And for once, Leonard Drake stood taller than the bench itself. They didn't speak right away. No one did. Not when the senator was led out in cuffs. Not when the door clicked shut behind him. For a long moment, the room simply breathed, quietly, uneasily, like a town that had just seen itself in the mirror for the first time in years. Then, the first shift. From the third bench, an elderly man stood, the same one who had once rolled his eyes at Leonard Drake when he entered the diner. His cap trembled in his hand. He walked forward, not to shake hands, not to say anything grand, but to stand, right there beside Leonard, silent, present. The gesture needed no words. A woman followed, 40, maybe 50, someone who had crossed the street to avoid him once. Now, she stepped forward, digging through her purse, pulling out a crumpled dollar bill and a receipt. She looked at Leonard. "This was for the coffee you bought me, back in '98. I never said thank you." She left the receipt on the bench and walked away. Then came the barista, the young man who had muttered, "Get a job," under his breath. He didn't say anything, just placed a napkin in front of Leonard and a freshly brewed cup of black coffee. No sugar, no cream, exactly how Leonard always took it. One by one they came, not to apologize with speeches, but with presence. A nod, a bowed head, a hand briefly resting on Leonard's shoulder. And Leonard? He didn't preach. He didn't gloat. He stood the way he always had, spine straight, gaze level, like a man who had long since made peace with being misunderstood. Then slowly, he turned to face the American flag in the corner of the room, faded, frayed, but upright. He looked at it like an old friend, not perfect, but never abandoned. General Everett Ward didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence now felt like approval. Judge Franklin Ward sat motionless, but the gavel before him was no longer a weapon. It was just wood. Colonel Mason Briggs watched from his seat, eyes fixed on Leonard, not with pity, but with respect. And Alyssa Monroe closed her folder gently, as if sealing a chapter that had been open far too long. Then, the doors opened again. Not with force, just enough for sunlight to thread through the room like a line of hope. A boy entered. 16. maybe 17. Leonard recognized him. The same kid who once filmed him from the sidewalk, mocking him with friends. But now, the boy carried no camera, only nervous hands, and a folded letter. "Mr. Drake," he said softly, "my dad's the principal. He wants to know if you'd come speak at the school." Leonard didn't smile. He just nodded, and the room breathed again. Not with guilt, but with grace. And when Leonard stepped outside, the wind caught the edge of the old flag and lifted it, just enough to let it dance once more. Not like a banner, but like a place remembering how to honor its own. The diner didn't change overnight. It changed in gestures, in quiet decisions made by hands that once folded arms and now folded flags. A week after the courtroom, the jukebox was unplugged, not out of protest, but respect. In its place stood a glass case holding an old, folded American flag, the cloth slightly worn, its corners softened by years. Below it, a small brass plaque. Sergeant Leonard Drake, honor earned, never demanded. Above the counter, a black and white photograph appeared. A young Marine standing tall in a foreign field. Face uncaptioned, unnamed, but unmistakably Leonard. No banner explained it. No tribute was declared. But people noticed. The man who once scoffed at Leonard's old jacket now paused to hold the door open when he saw him approach. The waitress who had once rushed his order now poured his coffee without asking, with hands that moved slower, more careful. Then came the mural. No grand unveiling, just brushstrokes behind the town library. A pair of boots by a bench, a folded coat hanging by a nail, a lone chair facing sunrise. No faces. No slogans. Just presence. A new generation was watching. At the high school, a teacher introduced a project called Silent Valor. Students were told to interview veterans. Dozens requested Leonard by name. He never told war stories. He told of mornings, of walking alone, of flags that were just fabric until someone saluted. One student wrote, "I thought courage was loud, but I was wrong." "It looks like Mr. Drake." A girl who once laughed behind his back posted a video. "He never asked to be seen. That's why we had to look." It was shared by thousands, none of them seeking likes, only understanding. The veterans group built a small display case in the corner booth Leonard used to sit in. Inside, his old cap, a copy of the letter from the principal inviting him to speak, and a newspaper clipping faded at the edges. No fanfare. Just memory. Leonard never spoke about any of it. He still walked the same path every morning, same coat, same cane, same pause at the river. But now, sometimes, a child would wave. Sometimes, a hand would rest briefly on his shoulder. And one morning, a young man sat beside him at the bench. No questions. Just silence. Then, "Thank you for not leaving." Leonard didn't answer. He simply looked ahead and nodded. That nod traveled farther than word. The bench near the river now bore a new engraving. Leonard Drake sat here often, spoke when needed, and inside the diner, under the photo, someone had written in block letters, "Come in, sit down, listen." It wasn't Leonard's handwriting, but somehow it sounded exactly like him. They sat in the booth by the window, just the two of them. The same spot where silence once felt like distance. Now, it held something gentler. Outside, the light slanted low across the street, warm and dusty, catching flecks of dust that drifted lazily in the golden air. Two mugs rested between them. Leonard Drake drank his black. Colonel Mason Briggs had added a little cream, just like he did as a boy when his father wasn't looking. Neither spoke at first. The clink of a spoon, the soft hum of the air conditioner, that was all. Leonard's eyes, older now, found the world outside more interesting than his son's stare. But when Mason finally said, "You okay, old man?" it didn't sound teasing. It sounded like a question he'd been carrying for years. Leonard turned, not sharply, not with weight, but as if that question deserved his full attention. "I'm fine. Just surprised you still remember how I take my coffee." "I remember a lot more than I used to admit," Mason said, and then pulled something from his jacket. A small photo, yellowing at the edges. Leonard, younger, holding a newborn in uniform. The photo was creased but intact, kept safe by someone who never stopped looking at it. "I carried this through every deployment," Mason continued. "It wasn't strategy or orders that got me through. It was this." Leonard didn't reach for the photo. He didn't have to. His eyes told the story. Quiet regret, pride too long withheld, and something softer rising beneath them both. "I thought I had to earn your respect out there," Mason whispered. "Turns out you were waiting here all along." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was sacred. Around them, the diner murmured faintly. Plates clinked, chairs shifted. But it all sounded far away, like the world had taken a step back to give them space. Leonard finally reached forward, not to speak, not to explain, but to rest a hand on his son's. Just that. A palm weathered by war, age, and memory, touching the knuckles of a man once lost in shadows. It was enough. Then the jukebox clicked alive. Not loud, not intentional, just a song queued up from another time. It was a very good year. Sinatra's voice filled the quiet like a memory. Mason chuckled softly. "You still play that one?" Leonard's voice almost a breath. "Only when I remember who I used to be." They didn't finish their coffee. They didn't need to. When they rose, Mason tucked the photo back into his wallet. Leonard placed a few bills beneath the saucer. As they stepped outside, the light bathed them both in amber. They didn't hug. They didn't pose. They just walked, side by side. And that said everything. They didn't hang banners. They didn't throw parades. But if you listen closely, in barbershops and bakeries, in church pews and late-night diner booths, you'd hear the name Leonard Drake spoken with a reverence usually reserved for men who'd long been buried beneath marble stones. At Jefferson High, a teacher set aside 10 quiet minutes every Friday to let students read letters written by veterans. One day, a girl raised her hand and said, "I think we forgot someone right here in town." The room stilled. She pointed to a clipping taped beside the chalkboard, a photo of Leonard, blurred but unmistakable, standing straight beneath the old bar sign, his jacket stiff with medals and silence. At the public library, a boy who once snickered when a veteran limped past now returned every Tuesday, not to check out books, but to sit beside Mr. Callahan, a retired sergeant with cloudy eyes, and ask, what was Korea really like? Outside the fire station, someone replaced the torn flag. No ceremony. No announcement. Just a young man, jeans dusty, hammering a new bracket into brick, because some things shouldn't sag in the wind. Leonard never told his story. He never needed to. The town carried it for him. A local podcast replayed the diner incident, not for drama, but because it reminded us who we were supposed to be. A church bulletin simply read, "Forgive us, Leonard, and thank you." At the hardware store, Mason Briggs was overheard telling a stranger. He never raised his voice, but he made the whole damn room stand taller. Kids who once rolled their eyes now stood in silence when a veteran walked by. One boy at the high school started opening doors every morning, just because. A girl asked her grandpa about the war for the first time, and a freshman art student, quiet as snowfall, painted a mural behind the library. A faded marine jacket resting on a diner chair, and a handprint on the back. Leonard still walked to the cafe every morning, still ordered black coffee, and left a folded napkin over the second cup. No one asked why. But every now and then, a stranger would sit across from him, nod once, and say nothing. Because sometimes, nothing is the loudest way to remember. And just this week, as wind cut across the square and rustled the new flag over the memorial, A little boy stopped, looked up, and saluted. He didn't know the whole story, just enough to know he should stand still. The story wasn't done. It was still walking, slowly, like boots on old pavement, echoing further with each quiet step. When Leonard Drake stood to leave that afternoon, no one moved. The jukebox, once humming in the background, had gone silent mid-song, as if even the music knew this was no time to interrupt. The sun filtered through the window blinds, tracing soft lines across his worn jacket. A waitress near the counter placed her hand gently over her chest. Not because someone asked, but because it felt like the only right thing left to do. Leonard paused at the door. Didn't turn, didn't wave. Just stared at the small American flag now taped above the bar mirror. Creased, humble, but proud. Then, almost like passing on a command, he said to the boy sweeping the floor, "You don't have to be loud to be strong. Just stand for something that lasts longer than your voice." He walked out, and no one spoke for a full minute. The flag swayed once, caught in a breeze that wasn't there. If that silence moved something in you, don't scroll. Type legacy in the comments, so he knows you heard him. And if you still believe respect doesn't need permission, walk with us. This channel is your home now.